first thing anyone in Shasta County heard was not a rumor. It was a confirmation. On the morning after the discovery, the National Park Service released a brief statement that seemed impossible to believe. The man found near the northern edge of Lassen Volcanic National Park in October 2023 had been identified as Nathan Brooks, a federal park ranger who had vanished 7 years earlier while on duty. For most Americans, it was the kind of headline that appeared for a few hours on phones, news sites, and local broadcasts before being replaced by something else. For the people who had once searched for him, worked beside him, or waited for him to come home, it tore open a chapter they had never truly closed. Nathan Brooks had disappeared in September 2016, during what should have been a routine geothermal survey in the Warner Valley area of Lassen Volcanic National Park. At the time, he was 42 years old, a respected ranger with more than a decade of field experience, known among colleagues as steady, careful, and deeply familiar with the hazards of volcanic terrain. He was not new to isolation, sudden weather changes, damaged trails, or the strange unpredictability of geothermal ground. His job required patience, judgment, and the ability to make calm decisions in places where help could be hours away. To the public, Nathan was a missing park ranger. To the National Park Service, he was one of their own. To his wife, Marissa Brooks, and their young son, Caleb, he was the center of a home that had never recovered from the day he failed to return. In 2016, Nathan's assignment had been straightforward on paper. Heavy rain had passed through parts of Northern California, and the park needed updated field notes on trail conditions, geothermal activity, and possible ground instability in the Warner Valley region. The area was not the most visited part of Lassen, but it mattered. Rangers monitored it because geothermal systems could change without much warning, and because even small shifts in unstable terrain could become dangerous for hikers, researchers, and staff. Nathan was assigned to check a route near the southern side of the park, record any changes around hot spring activity, evaluate sections of trail after the rainfall, and report back before evening. It was the kind of task he had done many times before. There was no special warning attached to it. No emergency. No sign that the day would become the dividing line between the life his family knew and the long uncertainty that followed. At the ranger station, the assignment was logged as normal fieldwork. His route was documented. His equipment was standard. His experience made him the obvious choice for the survey. Nothing in the official record suggested that anyone expected trouble beyond the usual risks of working in remote geothermal terrain. That ordinary detail later became one of the cruelest parts of the story. For years, the case of Nathan Brooks rested in that unbearable space between tragedy and mystery. Search teams had gone through the area. Agencies had reviewed his route. Specialists had considered the possibility of a fall, geothermal collapse, injury, disorientation, or exposure. In the end, the most accepted explanation was that the land itself had taken him. It was a painful explanation, but it fit the fears people already had about the backcountry. In wild places, especially volcanic ones, even experienced professionals could disappear. But in October 2023, that explanation collapsed. When Nathan was found alive, the story was no longer about a ranger lost in the wilderness. It became a question of what had happened after he vanished, who had kept him from the world, and how a man presumed dead had endured 7 years without being seen, heard, or found. The early medical evaluations made one fact clear. Nathan had not survived freely in the forest. He had not spent 7 years moving from shelter to shelter, hunting for food, and living beyond the reach of civilization. His condition told a darker story. He had been deprived, confined, weakened, and kept alive under circumstances no one at first could fully explain. The signs of long-term captivity were impossible to ignore, and they changed the emotional weight of the case instantly. For Marissa Brooks, the confirmation was almost too much to hold. For 7 years, she had lived between grief and refusal. She had heard the careful language of officials, the condolences from neighbors, the theories from strangers, and the quiet suggestion that accepting his death might someday bring peace. But acceptance had never come cleanly. Nathan had been too disciplined, too familiar with the terrain, too committed to procedure. Something about the disappearance had always felt unfinished. Caleb had grown from a small child into a teenager under the shadow of a father whose absence had no final answer. In American homes touched by long-term missing person cases, time does not move normally. Birthdays pass, school years change, holidays arrive, and yet one question remains fixed at the center of everything. Is he gone? Or is he somewhere no one has found? In 2023, that question was answered in the most shocking way possible. Nathan Brooks was alive. The park community reacted with disbelief first, then with urgency. Former co-workers, investigators, medical staff, and federal officials understood that his return was not the ending of the case. It was the beginning of a far more disturbing investigation. If Nathan had survived 7 years, then someone had controlled those 7 years. If he had returned in such a state, then the danger had not been theoretical. It had been human. The public version of the story spread quickly, but behind the official statements was a quieter truth. Nathan's survival was nearly impossible. He had lived through prolonged isolation, physical decline, hunger, darkness, uncertainty, and the psychological violence of being erased from ordinary life. Yet he had remained Nathan Brooks. Somewhere inside those 7 stolen years, he had held on to memory, identity, and the belief that returning to his family still mattered. That was what made the case more than a crime story. It became a story about endurance in its most stripped-down form. Not heroic in a polished way. Not dramatic in the way movies often make survival look. It was the kind of survival built from discipline, memory, and the refusal to let captivity decide the final meaning of a life. In October 2023, at the edge of Lassen Volcanic National Park, the man everyone had mourned came back into the world. His return did not erase the years that had been taken from him. It did not heal Marissa's waiting or Caleb's childhood shaped by absence. But it did one thing no one had believed possible anymore. It brought the truth back with him. On September 18, 2016, Nathan Brooks's final patrol began as an ordinary entry in an ordinary field log. At 1:40 p.m., his assignment was recorded at the Warner Valley Ranger Station. The route was clear, the purpose was specific, and the expected return time left enough margin before evening for a standard check-in. Nothing about the entry suggested urgency. Nothing in the notes suggested that anyone at the station believed the survey would become a federal case, a family tragedy, and eventually one of the most unsettling disappearances ever connected to Lassen Volcanic National Park. Nathan's task was to inspect a section of the Warner Valley area after a period of heavy rain. The park needed updated information about trail stability, geothermal changes, and any signs of unusual activity around the less traveled portions of the southern district. In a park shaped by volcanic heat, shifting ground, steam vents, and unpredictable mineral deposits, that kind of work was not unusual. Rangers like Nathan were trained to treat small changes seriously, because in places like Lassen, small changes could become warnings. His registered route took him through a less crowded part of the park, toward the geothermal zone near Terminal Geyser, then back toward the station before dark. It was not a tourist-heavy path. It was the kind of area mostly known to rangers, researchers, maintenance crews, and experienced hikers. For Nathan, that was part of the job. He had spent years learning how to read those remote sections with patience and discipline. His colleagues trusted his judgment because he did not dramatize risk, but he also did not dismiss it. The first radio check came at 2:25 p.m. According to the communications log, Nathan reported that the assigned route was clear and that he had not encountered visitors in the survey area. That detail mattered later, though at the time it seemed routine. No visitors meant fewer immediate concerns. No stranded hikers, no off-trail tourists, no medical situation requiring backup. The survey remained exactly what it had been when he signed out. A professional field check after rainfall. The second update came at 3:08 p.m. Nathan noted that the sulfur odor near the western edge of the geothermal survey area seemed stronger than expected. He did not describe it as an emergency. He did not request assistance. He simply logged the observation in the careful language of someone trained to separate concern from panic. Stronger sulfur odor could mean nothing more than ordinary geothermal variation after rain. It could also indicate a change in venting, ground temperature, or underground pressure. The point of the survey was to notice details like that before they became hazards. At the station, the note was received without alarm. Nathan was exactly where his assignment placed him. His communication was clear. His timing matched the planned route. There was no reason to think anything was wrong. That normalcy would later become one of the most painful parts of the record. The logs did not show a man lost or afraid. They showed a ranger doing his job, calmly documenting conditions in an area he understood. At 3:52 p.m., Nathan made his final transmission. The recording was short, but it changed everything after the fact. He reported seeing a weak reflection of light near a low rock opening close to the tree line, in a place where no authorized research team, maintenance crew, or visitor group was supposed to be. It was not described as sunlight on water or glare from his own equipment. It was unusual enough for him to mention it during an official check-in. That single detail would haunt the investigation for years. A faint light where there should have been no light. The radio connection ended shortly after the report. At first, the loss of contact did not automatically mean disaster. Remote terrain could interfere with radio signals. Geothermal features, rock formations, and low areas could create dead zones. Rangers knew that communication gaps happened. A missed reply was concerning, but not immediately catastrophic. The problem was that Nathan did not reestablish contact. The station attempted to reach him again through the assigned channel. No response came. Additional calls were made on backup frequencies. Still nothing. The communication team waited for the kind of delayed reply that sometimes followed a terrain-related signal drop. But the silence continued. Then his GPS signal stopped transmitting in the same general window of time. The combination changed the situation. A radio dead zone could be explained. A GPS interruption could be explained. But both failing after a report of an unexplained light in an unauthorized area created a pattern no one could comfortably ignore. Even then, the first assumption was still practical, not criminal. Nathan may have moved into a bad reception pocket. He may have encountered unstable ground. He may have been delayed by a hazard he had stopped to assess. He may have needed to take a longer route back. In fieldwork, especially in national parks, the line between routine delay and emergency can be thin. Agencies do not want to overreact every time a ranger misses a check-in by a few minutes. But they also know that waiting too long in remote terrain can cost lives. By late afternoon, the Warner Valley staff had begun treating Nathan's silence as a serious concern. The official timeline remained precise because precision was all they had. 1:40 p.m., assignment logged. 2:25 p.m., route clear. 3:08 p.m., stronger sulfur odor noted. 3:52 p.m., unexplained light reported. After that, nothing. For Marissa Brooks, those times would later become numbers she could never forget. They were not just entries in a report. They were the last measurable pieces of her husband's known life before the world lost track of him. Every minute after 3:52 p.m. became a blank space filled by theories, regrets, and questions no one could answer. For Nathan's colleagues, the final transmission created a different kind of burden. Rangers are trained to trust procedure. Routes, logs, check-ins, equipment, maps, and emergency plans exist because the wilderness does not forgive carelessness. Nathan had followed those procedures. He had checked in. He had reported what he saw. He had left a trail of information exactly the way a responsible ranger should. And still, he disappeared. The mention of the light did not become central right away. In the first hours, the priority was finding Nathan alive. The strange reflection was just one detail among many. Weather, terrain, geothermal instability, possible injury, equipment failure, and fading daylight. No one yet understood that this small observation might be the first sign that Nathan had not encountered an accident at all. By the time the station's concern became an emergency response, the official story of Nathan Brooks had already crossed into uncertainty. A trained ranger had entered a remote geothermal area for a scheduled survey. He had reported normal conditions, then an unusual environmental change, then a light that did not belong. Minutes later, his voice vanished from the radio record, and his location disappeared from the digital map. In the years that followed, investigators would replay that final hour again and again. They would study the timing, the signal loss, the route, the terrain, and the language of his last report. They would ask whether Nathan had gone closer to the source of the light, whether someone had been waiting beyond the mapped trail, whether the dead zone had been accidental or used deliberately. But on September 18, 2016, no one knew any of that. All they knew was that Nathan Brooks was somewhere inside Warner Valley. His radio was silent, his GPS had gone dark, and the last thing he had reported was a light in a place where no light should have been. By the time Nathan Brooks failed to return to Warner Valley Ranger Station, the concern inside the park had already moved beyond routine delay. In remote fieldwork, a ranger could lose signal for a while. A route could take longer than planned. A section of unstable ground could force a slower return. But Nathan was not careless with procedure. He had signed out correctly, checked in on schedule, reported conditions clearly, and then vanished from every system meant to keep him connected. That was what turned the first hours into an emergency. The night duty team initiated the standard missing ranger response, but nothing about the situation felt standard for long. Nathan was not an inexperienced hiker who had wandered away from a marked trail. He was a federal ranger familiar with the terrain, trained in field safety, equipped for a survey, and expected back before dark. The initial search plan began with the most logical assumption. If something had happened, it had happened somewhere along his registered patrol route. Teams divided the search zone according to priority. The first focus was the route Nathan had entered into the log before leaving the station. From there, the search widened toward the geothermal survey area, the western edge where he had reported the stronger sulfur odor, and the section near the low rock opening where he had mentioned the unexplained light. Every minute mattered, because the first night after a disappearance often determines whether a missing person is found alive. The first search crews expected to find a sign that would make sense of the silence. A damaged radio, a dropped field notebook, a section of disturbed ground, a clear track leading away from the route. Something that would explain why a trained ranger had stopped communicating after one brief, unusual report. Instead, the clues were almost cruel in how little they gave. A small piece of fabric from Nathan's ranger jacket was found near damp ground at the edge of the route. It was not enough to explain anything. It did not reveal whether he had been injured, caught on something, or taken off course. Not far from it, a short sequence of boot prints appeared and then ended on harder ground. They did not continue in a way searchers could follow. They did not show a clear struggle. They did not show pursuit. They simply stopped being useful. That was the beginning of the pattern that would define the entire search. Every lead opened a question and then ended before it became an answer. There were no signs of a large animal attack. No evidence suggested that Nathan had been dragged away by wildlife. There were no scattered personal items, no shredded equipment, no blood trail, no torn pack, no broken radio left behind. The absence of those things should have been reassuring, but it was not. In a missing person case, emptiness can become its own kind of evidence. The cleaner the disappearance looked, the harder it became to accept as an ordinary accident. The search expanded quickly. Ground teams worked through the registered route and the surrounding areas. K-9 units were brought in to assist. Helicopters were used to scan difficult terrain. Thermal technology was deployed in the hope that Nathan might still be somewhere nearby, injured but alive. Agencies coordinated in the way Americans often see during high-stakes searches on public land. Local responders, federal personnel, park staff, volunteers, and specialists all trying to turn procedure into hope. For Nathan's co-workers, the effort was personal. Park rangers understand the risks of the job in a way the public often does not. They are law enforcement officers, rescuers, field scientists, public servants, and first responders, sometimes all in the same week. They respond to injured tourists, unstable weather, illegal activity, wildfires, medical emergencies, and remote hazards that do not care how experienced someone is. When one of them disappears, the search carries both professional urgency and a quiet fear no one wants to name. Still, Nathan's experience kept shaping the expectations. If he had been hurt, he would likely have tried to signal. If he had become disoriented, he would likely have relied on training. If his radio failed, His GPS should have continued. If the GPS failed, he still had field knowledge, maps, and survival equipment. Every scenario that explained one failure failed to explain all of them together. The unexplained light from his final transmission remained in the report, but it was not yet the center of the investigation. In the early stage, searchers did not have the luxury of building theories around one strange detail. They had to search the ground in front of them. They had to assume Nathan was somewhere reachable. They had to treat every hour as if rescue were still possible. As days passed, the emotional tone of the operation changed. The first stage had been urgent and hopeful. The next became disciplined and grim. Search maps filled with completed grids. Areas were checked, marked, and checked again. Terrain specialists reviewed geothermal hazards. Investigators studied whether unstable ground could have collapsed beneath him. The possibility of a hidden thermal feature became one of the most accepted explanations because it matched the danger of the region and required no human suspect. That explanation was devastating, but it offered a kind of order. If Nathan had stepped into an unstable geothermal zone, the Earth itself might have hidden the evidence. Steam, heat, mineral crust, and soft ground could erase traces quickly. It was a horrifying possibility, but in the absence of stronger proof, it became easier for officials to discuss than the idea that someone else had been there. Marissa Brooks had to live inside that uncertainty from the beginning. She received updates filled with careful language, the kind used when officials want to be honest without destroying hope. Search continues. No confirmed location. No evidence of survival yet. Still evaluating the area. Expanding the perimeter. Bringing in additional resources. Those phrases became part of the family's life. They sounded professional, but they did not answer the only question that mattered. Caleb was still young enough that the full machinery of the search could not be explained to him in adult terms. What could be understood was absence. His father had gone to work and had not come home. In many American families connected to law enforcement, firefighting, military service, or public safety, there is always some awareness that duty can carry risk. But Nathan's job had never seemed like the kind that would split a family's life in two without warning. After nearly 2 weeks, the operation no longer resembled the urgent rescue effort of the first night. It became a search for remains, evidence, or any explanation that could give the family and the agency a final answer. Yet even that did not come. The land gave back almost nothing. The official conclusion settled slowly, not because it was satisfying, but because the investigation had nowhere else to go. Nathan Brooks was recorded as missing in the line of duty, presumed to have died after an accident in remote geothermal terrain. The theory fit enough of the facts to be accepted, but not enough to bring peace. It explained the danger of the area. It explained why recovery might be difficult. It did not explain the light. It did not explain the sudden failure of communication and GPS together. It did not explain why a man trained to survive had left behind so little. For the National Park Service, the loss became a solemn internal wound. For the public, it became another tragic reminder that America's national parks, beautiful as they are, can still be unforgiving. For Marissa, it became something more complicated than grief. Grief requires an ending. Nathan's case gave her a date, a location, and a theory, but no body, no certainty, and no final moment she could believe in. The search ended, but the questions did not. In the official files, the case could be summarized in clean terms. A ranger disappeared during a geothermal survey. Extensive search efforts failed. Evidence suggested a possible environmental accident. But behind that language was a truth no one could resolve in 2016. Nathan Brooks had followed procedure, reported something out of place, and vanished so completely that even the best search teams in the region could not find him. For 7 years, that was the story. A missing ranger, a grieving family, a dangerous stretch of land, a final transmission about a light that should not have been there, and then silence. On October 22, 2023, the case of Nathan Brooks stopped being a cold file and became something far more unsettling. The first official report came from the northern side of Lassen Volcanic National Park, near a small community where people were used to seeing hikers, seasonal workers, park employees, and travelers passing through. At first, the man found there was treated as an unidentified person in medical distress. He had no clear identification that immediately explained who he was. His condition suggested prolonged deprivation, not a short-term accident. The responders who handled the first report understood quickly that this was not a routine welfare call. Within hours, the case moved from local concern to federal attention. The name Nathan Brooks did not appear publicly at first. Authorities needed confirmation, and in a case this extraordinary, no agency wanted to release information based on resemblance or assumption. 7 years had passed since Nathan disappeared. His missing person file had become part of a painful archive of unresolved cases tied to public land. Families of missing people across America know how cruel false hope can be, and investigators knew that one wrong statement could devastate the Brooks family all over again. The confirmation came through fingerprints, dental records, and DNA comparison. Each result pointed to the same impossible answer. The unidentified man was not someone who resembled Nathan Brooks. He was Nathan Brooks. For the National Park Service, the news was almost impossible to process. Nathan had been presumed dead since 2016. His disappearance had been explained, at least officially, as a likely accident in a dangerous geothermal area. That theory had shaped the agency's final reports, the public understanding of the case, and the way many people had learned to speak about him. He had become a ranger lost in the line of duty, remembered with grief and respect. But living evidence had returned. The discovery did not bring simple relief. It brought shock first, then a hard wave of questions. If Nathan Brooks was alive in October 2023, where had he been since September 18, 2016? Why had he never contacted his family? Why had no search team found him? Why had all communication stopped that afternoon? And most urgently, who or what had kept him from returning for 7 years? The medical findings changed the direction of the case almost immediately. Doctors at a hospital in Redding examined Nathan under the supervision of federal authorities. The initial conclusions were clear enough to overturn the original theory of wilderness survival. Nathan had not spent 7 years living freely in the backcountry. His physical condition was not consistent with a man who had survived by moving through the forest, building shelters, fishing, foraging, and avoiding discovery. It was consistent with long-term confinement. The evidence was difficult for investigators to absorb, but it could not be ignored. Nathan showed signs of severe malnutrition over a prolonged period. His body reflected extended lack of sunlight, limited mobility, and repeated physical decline followed by partial recovery. There were old injuries at different stages of healing. His system showed deficiencies that doctors associated with chronic deprivation. The pattern was not random. It suggested control. That single word changed everything. Control meant another person. It meant Nathan's disappearance had not been a tragic accident caused by unstable ground or geothermal danger. It meant that for 7 years, someone had likely decided whether he ate, whether he had light, whether he had warmth, whether he lived through another day. The investigation was no longer about finding a missing ranger. It was about uncovering a crime that had remained hidden since 2016. For Marissa Brooks, the confirmation shattered every emotional boundary she had built to survive the previous 7 years. She had been told to consider the possibility that Nathan was gone. She had lived with memorial language, official sympathy, community support, and the quiet pressure to move forward without certainty. She had raised Caleb through birthdays, school milestones, and ordinary American family routines with an absence sitting at the center of all of them. Now the absence had a name again. Nathan was alive, but the man who returned carried the cost of 7 stolen years. That truth made the reunion complicated in a way no headline could capture. The country often likes survival stories to arrive wrapped in triumph. The missing person returns, the family embraces relief, the community celebrates a miracle. But real survival after prolonged captivity does not unfold so neatly. Relief and grief arrive together. Gratitude does not erase damage. A living return does not return the lost years. Caleb, now a teenager, had to face a reality few children ever face. His father had not abandoned him. His father had not simply died in the wilderness. His father had been kept from him. The explanation that once tried to soften the mystery was replaced by something more painful, but also more truthful. Nathan had wanted to come home. He had not been allowed to. That fact became central to the emotional meaning of his return. In the days after he was identified, federal investigators moved carefully. Nathan's medical condition required protection, and his memories could not be forced into a clean timeline. Trauma after prolonged captivity often returns in fragments. A person may remember sounds, routines, smells, materials, certain repeated patterns, or isolated moments long before being able to form a full account. Investigators understood that the case would depend not only on forensic evidence, but also on Nathan's ability to reclaim pieces of 7 years that captivity had tried to erase. What became clear early was that Nathan had survived through discipline, not luck alone. The instincts that had made him a good ranger had helped keep him alive. He had been trained to observe small changes and treat details as information. In confinement, that training became a survival system. Without a normal clock, he tracked time through repeated sounds and changes in temperature. Without control over food, he learned to conserve energy and recognize patterns in deprivation. Without contact with the outside world, he preserved identity through memory. His name, his family, his badge number, his last assignment, the date he disappeared. Those were not dramatic gestures. They were quiet acts of resistance. In captivity, forgetting can become another kind of death. Nathan survived by refusing to become only a prisoner. He remained a husband, a father, a ranger, and a witness. That was why his return mattered beyond the shock of the headline. Nathan Brooks had not only endured the physical conditions that nearly destroyed him, he had preserved enough of himself to lead investigators back toward the truth. Even before he could provide a complete account, his condition alone testified against the old explanation. The wilderness had not held him for 7 years. Someone had. The National Park Service began reviewing the 2016 file with new urgency. Every old assumption had to be questioned. The final radio report about the unexplained light no longer sounded like a strange field observation. It sounded like a warning. The lost GPS signal no longer seemed like a technical failure in difficult terrain. It became a possible part of a larger sequence. The lack of evidence along the search route, once attributed to geothermal danger, now suggested that the original search may have been looking for the wrong kind of disappearance. For the public, the story became national news because it touched a deep American fear. That even in protected public lands, even among trained professionals, danger can come not only from nature but from people hiding within it. Lassen Volcanic National Park had always been understood as a place of geological risk, remote trails, and natural power. Nathan's return revealed another possibility buried beneath the original case. A deliberate human act concealed behind the reputation of the land itself. By the end of October 2023, the Brooks case had fully transformed. It was no longer a closed missing person file. It was an active federal investigation into a 7-year captivity. The man once presumed dead was alive. The family once asked to accept uncertainty now faced a truth more painful and more hopeful than anyone had prepared them for. Nathan Brooks had come back from a place no one yet understood. His survival did not answer every question. It raised the most urgent ones. And after 7 years of silence, the search for what really happened had finally begun. The first weeks after Nathan Brooks's return were not built around answers. They were built around fragments. Federal investigators wanted a timeline. Doctors wanted stability. His family wanted the man they had lost to feel safe in the world again. But Nathan's mind did not return from 7 years of captivity in a straight line. The facts came back unevenly, sometimes as a repeated detail, sometimes as a sensory memory, sometimes as a piece of information that made no sense until another piece appeared days later. The investigators assigned to the case understood that pressure could destroy more than it revealed. Nathan was not a witness who had simply seen a crime and walked away from it. He had survived inside the crime for 7 years. His memory had been shaped by deprivation, fear, isolation, and the constant need to conserve himself. In cases like his, the truth often returns as patterns before it returns as statements. The first consistent pattern was the place. Nathan could not give an address. He could not identify a road. He could not describe a full route from where he had been held. But he remembered the structure of confinement with a precision that slowly became valuable. The place was artificial. It was not a cave. It was not a natural depression in the ground. It had been made by someone. The walls carried the smell of damp earth and old cement. The air held a metallic weight that never fully left. There was a narrow steel door with a horizontal slot. Beneath the floor, water seemed to pass through or collect somewhere low, creating a steady dripping sound that became one of the only ways he marked time. For 7 years, that sound had been more than noise. It had been a clock. Nathan had counted it when he could not count days. He had used the pauses between drips to steady his thoughts when hunger blurred everything else. When the light above him came on and off without warning, when food arrived irregularly, when the silence became too heavy, that repeating sound told him the world still had rhythm. Something still continued. Something still moved. The second pattern was light. There had not been sunlight, at least not in any direct form. Nathan remembered a weak artificial bulb or lamp, sometimes left on, sometimes cut off for long periods. At first, the irregularity broke his sense of time. Later, he learned not to depend on it. He stopped trusting the light as a measure of day or night. Instead, he built his own system from smaller things: the changing temperature in the concrete, the frequency of footsteps above or beyond the door, the number of times the generator sound came and went. That system became one of the reasons he survived. In the hospital, when specialists asked how he kept his mind from collapsing, Nathan's answer came slowly through repeated sessions. He had treated memory like a duty. Every day, or what he believed was a day, he repeated the same facts internally. His name was Nathan Daniel Brooks. He was a ranger with the National Park Service. His wife was Marissa. His son was Caleb. His last assignment had been Warner Valley. The date he left the station was September 18, 2016. He repeated those facts not because they could free him, but because losing them would mean captivity had taken more than his body. He also conserved energy with the discipline of a field ranger. He learned that panic consumed strength and strength had to be rationed. When food was scarce, he ate slowly and saved whatever could be saved. When water was available, he treated it like a tool for staying alive rather than a comfort. When injuries came, he learned to protect himself from infection as best he could with almost nothing. He monitored his own decline the way he had once monitored trail conditions. Carefully, without pretending the danger was smaller than it was. The investigators recorded these details because they mattered. Nathan had not drifted through 7 years in a blur. Even when he could not control his surroundings, he observed them. He remembered material, sound, smell, timing, and repetition. He survived by turning captivity into data. Those memories led investigators back to the 2016 file. The original search reports had been built around the theory of an accident. Now every item had to be re-examined with a different question. What if Nathan had not fallen into unstable ground? What if the light he reported had been connected to a hidden structure? What if the sudden communication failure was not a coincidence? What if the search had passed near evidence that no one knew how to interpret at the time? Old trail records, search maps, thermal scans, radio logs, GPS data, ranger notes, and camera footage were pulled into a new federal review. The process was methodical and it was painful. The more investigators found, the more obvious it became that small warning signs had been present in 2016, scattered among thousands of ordinary details. One wildlife camera image became especially important. It had been reviewed years earlier and dismissed as low-quality background interference. In the new review, analysts noticed a human-shaped figure near the edge of the frame. The figure was not clear enough to identify, but its location mattered. It appeared near the broader area where Nathan had last reported the unexplained light. At the time, no authorized crew was supposed to be working there. No visitor report placed anyone there. No maintenance activity had been scheduled. The image did not prove a suspect. It proved that the old assumption of an empty area could no longer stand. Another overlooked detail came from aerial imagery taken not long after Nathan disappeared. A patch of ground appeared darker than the surrounding area. In 2016, it had been treated as wet soil after rain, unremarkable in a region already being assessed for moisture, geothermal runoff, and trail damage. But under the new investigation, the patch was compared with later imagery, soil disturbance patterns, and Nathan's fragmented memories. The location became important enough to mark for further analysis. Then came the clothing. The garments Nathan had been wearing when he was found were examined with far more precision than in a normal missing person recovery. Trace evidence specialists identified particles of cement dust, crushed limestone, and industrial insulation fibers. Those materials did not fit the explanation of prolonged exposure in Lassen's natural terrain. They suggested a constructed space. Cement meant building. Limestone dust suggested material brought in from outside or used in a manufactured mixture. Insulation fibers implied someone had modified or reinforced a hidden structure. The evidence began to align with Nathan's memories too closely to ignore. A steel door, cement, damp earth, artificial light, water under the floor, a structure underground or partially buried, a person present in the area when no one should have been there. A strange patch of ground that might not have been natural after all. The old case was no longer simply reopened. It was being rewritten. For Nathan, the process was both necessary and brutal. Every remembered sound helped the investigation, but every memory also pulled him back toward the years he was trying to survive again in a different way. The country saw headlines about a ranger found alive. Investigators saw a witness fighting to recover evidence from the place where he had been nearly erased. Marissa saw a husband who had returned, but whose mind still carried rooms no family could enter for him. Caleb learned the truth in stages, as any teenager in such a situation would have to. His father's survival was a miracle, but not a clean one. It came with medical appointments, federal agents, protected information, and the slow understanding that the man he had missed for most of his childhood had spent those same years fighting not to disappear completely. The most painful part was also the most powerful. Nathan had remembered them. He had not known whether Marissa had been told he was dead. He had not known whether Caleb still thought about him. He had not known whether the outside world was still searching. But in the place below ground, he had used their names as anchors. When his body weakened, when the darkness stretched, when the silence tried to convince him that no one was left, he returned to those names. They were not sentimental memories. They were survival tools. They kept his identity intact when almost everything else was controlled by someone else. By late 2023, the federal team had enough to move beyond memory and into physical search. The combination of Nathan's statements, the old camera image, the unusual ground pattern, and the trace materials created a new target area south of Warner Valley. Investigators began coordinating with geologists, forensic specialists, and search personnel to examine ground features that had not been considered suspicious 7 years earlier. This time, they were not looking for a lost ranger. They were looking for the place where someone had kept him alive, hidden, and cut off from the world. And for the first time since September 18, 2016, the silence around Nathan Brooks began to break into evidence. The new search did not begin with hope. It began with evidence. By late 2023, federal investigators had stopped treating Nathan Brooks's memories as isolated trauma fragments and started treating them as field data. That shift mattered. Nathan had spent 7 years inside a place designed to erase him from the world, yet he had remembered enough to give investigators a pattern. Cement, damp earth, metal, weak artificial light, water beneath the floor, and a structure that had not formed naturally. Combined with the trace materials found on his clothing, the old camera image, and the unusual ground pattern south of Warner Valley, the case finally had a direction. The search area was not chosen by instinct. It was built from layers of analysis. LiDAR data gave investigators a way to read the ground beneath vegetation and surface debris. Old aerial images were compared with newer ones. Soil disturbance models were matched against possible hidden construction. Geologists reviewed the terrain to separate natural volcanic irregularities from human alteration. Forensic teams reviewed where cement dust and crushed limestone might reasonably appear, and where they should not appear at all. The result pointed toward a section of forest south of Warner Valley, outside the original highest priority search zone from 2016. At the time of Nathan's disappearance, that area had seemed less likely. It was not on his registered return path. It was not an obvious place for an injured ranger to end up. Search teams had passed broadly through nearby areas, but they had been looking for a missing man, not a hidden structure. In 2016, the assumption had been accident. In 2023, the assumption had changed to captivity. That difference changed what the land meant. A dark patch of ground was no longer just wet soil. A slight depression was no longer dismissed as erosion. A pile of old debris was no longer automatically natural. Investigators began asking a different question. What would a person build if he wanted to keep someone hidden near federal land without being noticed? The answer emerged beneath years of concealment. The structure was small, crude, and deliberately hidden. It had been covered in a way that made it blend into the surrounding ground from a casual distance. It was not a professional bunker in the cinematic sense. It was something rougher, meaner, and more practical. A buried holding space assembled by someone with enough construction knowledge to make it functional, but not enough care to make it safe. His purpose was not survival comfort. His purpose was containment. Inside, investigators found the physical version of Nathan's memories. There was unfinished cement. There were metal fixtures. There was evidence of a narrow door. There were marks where hardware had been anchored. There were signs of a simple ventilation system, poorly made but effective enough to sustain life. There were drainage traces that explained the sound Nathan had heard for years beneath the floor. The space was not large. It was not designed for dignity. It was designed to keep a person alive and unseen. For the investigators, the discovery was a turning point, but not a relief. Finding the place confirmed that Nathan had told the truth, even when his memories had come in broken pieces. It proved that he had not imagined the smell of cement, the dampness, the metal, the artificial light, or the water beneath him. It proved that the original accident theory had been wrong. It also proved that someone had built a hidden prison close enough to the park's remote systems to exploit their blind spots. The emotional force of that discovery moved through the case quietly. For 7 years, Nathan had been spoken of as a man likely lost to nature. Now the evidence showed that nature had been used as cover. The danger had not been the volcanic ground alone. It had been a person who understood how easily the wilderness could make evidence disappear. The forensic work inside the underground chamber was slow and careful. Investigators documented every surface, every trace, every construction choice. Even after attempts to clean the space, the structure still held evidence. Biological traces, fiber remnants, rust patterns, tool marks, fragments of insulation, and residue from building materials all helped build a timeline. The goal was not simply to prove that Nathan had been there. The goal was to identify who had built it, who had maintained it, and who had controlled access to it. The construction itself became a kind of signature. The chamber had been built with practical but uneven methods. The cement work showed experience, though not professional precision. The anchoring points suggested someone familiar with basic restraint hardware and improvised reinforcement. The ventilation system indicated a person who understood that a hidden underground space needed airflow. The concealment showed patience and familiarity with remote land. This was not random. It was planned. FBI behavioral analysts began building a profile from those details. The person they were looking for was likely older, physically accustomed to manual labor, and comfortable living outside normal community structures. He probably understood back roads, seasonal access routes, and areas where park boundaries, Forest Service land, and private parcels blurred in practice. He would not need advanced engineering training, but he would know enough about digging, pouring cement, setting metal, and hiding materials. He would likely have a history of conflict with land management authorities, especially over trespassing, unauthorized structures, or illegal occupation near public land. That profile led investigators back into old records. Reports from the National Park Service, county authorities, Forest Service contacts, and local law enforcement were reviewed for years before Nathan's disappearance. One name began appearing in the right places with the wrong kind of consistency: Raymond Harland. Raymond Harland was not famous, not publicly known, and not the kind of suspect who would have drawn national attention before the Brooks case. He lived on the margins of the rural Northern California communities surrounding public land. Over the years, he had been reported for illegal camping, unauthorized construction, storing scrap material near restricted areas, and refusing to comply with land use warnings. None of those incidents had seemed large enough at the time to predict a crime of this scale. But in hindsight, they formed a troubling pattern. He knew how to survive outside ordinary systems. He knew how to avoid attention. He knew how to collect and reuse construction materials. He had a documented interest in hidden shelters and off-grid spaces. Most importantly, he had been near the broader Lassen region during the years before Nathan disappeared. The old warnings against Harland had once seemed like nuisance violations. Now they looked different. A man who built without permits on land he did not own. A man who understood the gaps between agencies. A man familiar with remote routes and temporary concealment. A man with enough resentment toward federal authority to make investigators look again at every prior encounter. Nathan's own profession gave the possible motive a darker edge. He had been a federal ranger, part of the system Harland had repeatedly clashed with. In 2016, Nathan's patrol brought him into a part of Warner Valley where an unauthorized structure or activity might have been exposed. The final radio report about the unexplained light no longer stood alone. It now seemed possible that Nathan had noticed evidence of Harland's hidden work. The investigators did not rely on profile alone. They needed physical links. The bunker provided the first major bridge. Some construction materials matched types that appeared in prior reports connected to Harland's illegal sites. Tool marks suggested equipment consistent with items he was known to use or possess. Trace fibers from insulation were similar to materials recovered from abandoned structures previously associated with him. Records showed that Harland had purchased or scavenged materials that could have been used in the chamber's construction. None of that was enough by itself to close the case. But together it narrowed the world. For Marissa Brooks, the discovery of the underground chamber confirmed what she had feared and resisted at the same time. Nathan had not vanished into unknowable wilderness. He had been somewhere real, somewhere built, somewhere another person could have opened. That knowledge was devastating, but it also brought a form of clarity that the accident theory never had. The nightmare finally had walls, materials, and a direction. For Nathan, the confirmation carried a different weight. The place he had described existed. The sounds he had counted existed. The cement dust on his clothing had a source. The memories that had returned in fragments were not broken illusions. They were evidence. The discipline that helped him survive had also preserved the truth. By the end of the excavation and forensic review, the investigation had moved from discovery to pursuit. The hidden chamber south of Warner Valley proved that Nathan Brooks had been held in a constructed underground space. The behavioral profile and old land use records pointed toward Raymond Harland. The material evidence did not yet tell the whole story, but it had taken the case further than it had gone in 7 years. In 2016, searchers had looked across the land and found almost nothing. In 2023, investigators looked beneath what had been ignored and found the place where Nathan Brooks's missing years had been buried. By early November 2023, the investigation into Nathan Brooks's captivity had entered a new phase. The hidden underground chamber south of Warner Valley proved that someone had held him there. The behavioral profile pointed toward Raymond Harland. The construction evidence narrowed the field even further. But federal investigators still lacked the final connection required to move from suspicion to arrest. That changed when a second underground structure was discovered. The lead came through a combination of geographic analysis and old land use reports connected to Harland's movements over several years. Investigators noticed that certain remote areas linked to him shared the same practical advantages: distance from heavily traveled routes, weak oversight between jurisdictions, and enough natural isolation to discourage casual visitors. The first bunker had not been designed by someone improvising in panic. It had been built by someone who understood concealment as a long-term process. That realization forced investigators to consider the possibility that Nathan had not been held in only one place. Search teams expanded the operation into areas bordering Lassen National Forest and nearby undeveloped land. Federal agents worked alongside forensic specialists, local deputies, and park investigators to re-examine properties, abandoned camps, illegal structures, and remote utility traces that once seemed insignificant. The search was no longer about recovering evidence from the past. It was about finding a man who might still be living close to the system he had manipulated for years. The second bunker was smaller than the first, but more revealing. Unlike the underground chamber where Nathan had spent most of his captivity, this structure appeared to function partly as a storage and transition site. Investigators recovered construction material consistent with the first bunker, along with insulation fibers, rusted hardware, and biological traces. DNA recovered from multiple surfaces matched Raymond Harland. Partial fingerprints lifted from preserved material also connected directly to him. For the first time since Nathan's disappearance in 2016, the case had physical evidence that tied a specific person to the hidden structures. The emotional impact inside the investigative teams shifted immediately. Until then, there had still been a narrow possibility that the evidence pointed toward a dead suspect, an abandoned network, or a complicated chain of unknown individuals. The DNA changed that. Raymond Harland was not just a theoretical match to a behavioral profile anymore. He had been inside the structures connected to Nathan's captivity. Federal prosecutors began preparing emergency warrants while tactical teams reviewed Harland's history in detail. His background showed years of isolation from ordinary social systems. He drifted between temporary properties, off-grid locations, improvised shelters, and old cabins scattered through Northern California. He had a pattern of avoiding long-term registration, formal employment, and consistent records. Some people who had encountered him over the years described him as quiet and deeply suspicious of federal authority. Others remembered complaints about park regulations, land restrictions, and what he viewed as government intrusion into places where he believed he should be left alone. What disturbed investigators most was how effectively Harland had hidden in plain sight. He had never disappeared completely. He had simply existed at the edge of systems that rarely connect cleanly with one another. Minor violations involving illegal structures or unauthorized land use often stayed local and isolated. No one had previously imagined that the same man connected to those complaints could also be responsible for holding a federal ranger captive for 7 years. The search for Harland became a coordinated federal operation. Agencies treated the situation as high risk from the beginning. Nathan's survival proved that Harland was capable of prolonged control, planning, and concealment. The existence of multiple hidden structures suggested preparation rather than impulse. Investigators also had no guarantee Nathan was the only victim Harland had ever targeted, though no evidence at that stage confirmed additional abductions. Drone surveillance, thermal imaging, and land access reviews were used to narrow possible locations. One recurring challenge in rural Northern California is the enormous amount of semi-isolated land spread across overlapping jurisdictions. Cabins, hunting properties, temporary camps, old utility structures, and off-grid shelters can remain largely invisible unless someone has a reason to look closely. Harland had spent years exploiting that reality. The break came from a thermal scan conducted over a remote forested section beyond the original investigation zone. Analysts identified a heat signature inconsistent with abandoned structures in the area. The energy pattern suggested intermittent generator use rather than ordinary residential activity. That mattered because investigators already suspected Harland relied on portable power systems similar to those described indirectly through Nathan's memories. Surveillance confirmed signs of occupancy. The cabin itself had been deliberately disguised through neglect and concealment. From a distance, it appeared closer to abandoned storage than active residence. Investigators believed that was intentional. Harland had survived for years by understanding how people ignore what looks forgotten. Tactical teams approached the area with extreme caution after discovering improvised warning systems surrounding the property. The devices were not sophisticated military traps, but they revealed preparation and paranoia. Some were designed to create noise, Others appeared intended to slow or expose anyone approaching unexpectedly. To investigators, the traps carried the same psychological signature as the bunkers themselves: control through isolation, secrecy, and anticipation. The operation moved carefully because no one knew how Harland would respond if cornered. When federal agents entered the cabin, they found Raymond Harland inside and took him into custody without prolonged confrontation. By then, the investigation had already assembled enough evidence to connect him to Nathan's captivity. But the interior of the cabin expanded the case even further. Investigators recovered maps of Lassen Volcanic National Park and surrounding forest areas marked with handwritten notes and coded references. Several locations corresponded directly to the two underground structures already discovered. Construction tools, generators, cement material, insulation products, metal fixtures, and excavation equipment matched evidence from the bunkers. There were also records indicating long-term supply management consistent with maintaining hidden underground spaces over multiple years. Forensic specialists immediately began cataloging every item because the cabin represented more than a suspect's residence. It was the operational center of the captivity. The discovery answered questions that had haunted the investigation since Nathan returned. The hidden structures had not been temporary improvisations. They had been maintained deliberately. Nathan's survival had depended on systems someone monitored over years: ventilation, food supply, generator access, water control, and concealment. The cabin proved that Harland had organized those systems methodically enough to avoid detection even while living within driving distance of public infrastructure and federal land. For Nathan, the arrest marked the first moment since 2016 when the threat attached to his captivity became fully real to the outside world. Until then, much of the country knew him only as a survivor with fragmented memories. Now investigators had found the man connected to the underground chambers, the materials, the hidden locations, and the years Nathan had lost. The psychological effect was complicated. Survivors of long-term captivity often describe fear continuing long after physical escape because the mind does not immediately believe confinement has ended. Federal authorities worked closely with Nathan during the arrest phase to prevent leaks, speculation, and exposure that could destabilize his recovery. Even after Harland was taken into custody, Nathan reportedly struggled with the idea that someone else finally controlled the doors, not the man who had controlled them for 7 years. For Marissa and Caleb, the arrest carried a different kind of emotional weight. The mystery that once swallowed their family finally had a face. The silence surrounding Nathan's disappearance had not been caused by accident, wilderness, or fate. It had been caused by a man who chose to isolate another human being from the world for years. That realization changed how people around the case spoke about survival. Nathan Brooks had not survived a storm or a natural disaster. He had survived deliberate captivity. He had endured years designed to erase routine, identity, and hope, yet still returned with enough memory to guide investigators back to the structures and eventually to the man responsible. The search that began in 2016 with helicopters, trail maps, and geothermal theories had ended in a hidden cabin tied to a suspect who spent years believing the wilderness could protect him from scrutiny. Instead, the same details that once kept Nathan alive, memory, observation, patience, and discipline, had finally led federal investigators straight to Raymond Harland. The federal trial of Raymond Harland began in late 2024 under intense national attention. By then, the story of Nathan Brooks had already spread far beyond Northern California. Americans followed the case not only because of the crime itself, but because it forced people to confront something deeply unsettling. A man employed to protect public land had vanished during a routine assignment, survived 7 years in captivity, and returned carrying evidence that the wilderness had hidden a human crime rather than a natural tragedy. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors focused on structure, consistency, and time. The government's case did not rely on one dramatic revelation. It relied on accumulation. Every fragment that once seemed meaningless on its own became part of a chain impossible to dismiss when assembled together. DNA recovered from the second bunker matched Raymond Harland. Fingerprints connected him directly to materials used in the underground structures. The construction methods in both bunkers aligned with tools and equipment found in his cabin. Maps recovered during the arrest marked locations tied to Nathan's captivity. Supply records and salvaged materials connected Harland to years of maintenance and concealment activity. Most powerful of all was Nathan Brooks himself. He did not appear in court as the man who had disappeared in 2016. That man no longer existed in the same form. 7 years had changed him physically, emotionally, and psychologically in ways that no testimony could fully explain. But the discipline that kept him alive also made him a credible witness. He spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent years depending on observation to survive. He did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He described routines, sounds, materials, timing, and memory with the same restraint that once made him an excellent ranger. That restraint made the truth harder to ignore. Nathan described how he survived by dividing time into patterns because ordinary life had been taken away from him. He explained how the dripping beneath the floor became a measure of passing hours, how the generator cycles became a substitute for days, how repeating the names Marissa and Caleb kept him connected to a world he could no longer see. He described captivity not as a single moment of terror, but as a slow attempt to erase a person through isolation, deprivation, and uncertainty. For the jury, the emotional impact came less from spectacle and more from endurance. Nathan did not speak like someone telling an unbelievable story. He sounded like a man who had spent years forcing himself to remember reality so that reality could someday return to him. The defense attempted to challenge portions of the timeline and argued that trauma could affect memory reliability. But the physical evidence surrounding Harland made those arguments increasingly weak. The bunkers existed. The materials matched. The maps existed. The DNA existed. Nathan's memories matched the structures with disturbing accuracy long before investigators found them. The prosecution argued successfully that no coincidence could explain the totality of the evidence. The verdict came in early 2025. Raymond Harland was found guilty on federal charges including kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple related offenses connected to the concealed underground structures on federal land. The sentence was life imprisonment without realistic possibility of release. For many people following the case, the conviction felt like the natural ending of the story. The suspect had been captured. The survivor had returned. The system had reached a conclusion. But for the Brooks family, the verdict did not close 7 years of damage. Courts can punish crimes. They cannot return lost birthdays, missing graduations, broken routines, or years lived under the weight of uncertainty. Nathan's recovery continued long after the trial ended. Physical rehabilitation was only part of it. Long-term captivity affects the nervous system, memory, trust, sleep, and identity in ways that do not disappear because freedom returns. Nathan had to relearn ordinary life slowly. Noise affected him differently. Silence affected him differently too. Time itself no longer felt stable in the way it once had. For years, survival depended on rationing thought, conserving energy, and expecting control to belong to someone else. Freedom required a different kind of adjustment. Marissa also faced a reality few people understand unless they live through it. She had spent 7 years preparing emotionally for permanent loss while never fully accepting it. Then the person she mourned returned alive, carrying trauma that touched every part of their family. Relief and grief existed together. Love existed alongside the painful awareness that captivity had taken years they could never recover. Caleb, now old enough to understand the full truth, struggled with another layer of emotion entirely. He had spent most of his adolescence without a father, then suddenly had one again. But rebuilding connection after 7 years is not as simple as resuming where life stopped. Nathan had missed ordinary moments most families barely notice while living through them. School mornings, family dinners, small arguments, celebrations, disappointments, routines. Those absences could not be erased by survival alone. Yet even inside all that damage, something important remained intact. Nathan Brooks had come home with his identity still alive. That fact mattered deeply to the investigators, medical specialists, and park officials who spent months reviewing the case afterward. Captivity had isolated him physically, but it had failed to fully separate him from who he believed himself to be. Nathan survived because he kept holding onto ordinary human connections when everything around him was designed to strip them away. He remembered his family. He remembered his work. He remembered the life waiting beyond the underground room. Those memories became stronger than the isolation itself. The National Park Service treated the Brooks case as a turning point. Lassen Volcanic National Park and several other federal park regions reviewed field safety protocols for remote assignments. Rangers working isolated routes received updated emergency systems, including dual GPS tracking, expanded satellite communication equipment, and stricter solo patrol limitations in geothermal zones and low-access areas. Body cameras and emergency signal redundancy became more common in remote operations. Officials openly acknowledged that the old assumptions about risk had been incomplete. For years, people believed Nathan disappeared because the wilderness overwhelmed him. The truth was more disturbing. Wilderness had simply hidden what another person chose to do. Among rangers and search and rescue communities across the United States, Nathan's story became something larger than a criminal case. It became a reminder that survival is not always dramatic in the way popular culture imagines. Sometimes survival is repetitive, exhausting, and invisible. Sometimes it means holding on to memory when memory is the only freedom left. Sometimes it means refusing to let fear decide who you are. Nathan rarely spoke publicly after the trial. When he did, the focus was never revenge. He spoke more often about endurance, family, and the importance of being remembered. He understood something captivity had taught him very clearly. Isolation becomes most dangerous when a person begins to believe they no longer exist in anyone else's world. That was why the search mattered. For 7 years, teams kept records open. Marissa refused to let Nathan disappear emotionally, even when official explanations leaned toward death. Investigators revisited evidence others might have forgotten. Rangers remembered one of their own. Small details were preserved long enough for the truth to eventually connect itself. In many ways, Nathan Brooks survived twice. He survived the years underground, and he survived the silence that followed his disappearance. The case left a lasting mark on everyone involved because it exposed both the cruelty people are capable of and the resilience that can still outlast that cruelty. Raymond Harland spent years believing secrecy and isolation would protect him forever. In the end, what defeated him was not force alone. It was memory. Nathan remembered enough. His family remembered enough. The people searching for answers refused to let the story disappear completely. And perhaps that is what makes human beings different from the darkness we sometimes endure. Even after years of fear, isolation, and loss, people continue reaching for one another. They continue searching. They continue saying the names of the missing long after hope becomes difficult. Because somewhere deep inside us is the belief that no person should vanish from the world without someone still trying to bring them home. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story all the way to the end. Your attention, support, and presence truly mean more to us than words can fully express. Stories like this are not only about mystery or survival. They are about the strength of the human spirit, the importance of hope, and the quiet power of never giving up on the people we love. The story of Nathan Brooks reminds us that even in the darkest moments, a person can survive by holding on to memory, purpose, and the belief that someone is still waiting for them. It also reminds us that truth may disappear for a long time, but as long as people continue searching, caring, and remembering, the truth still has a chance to return to the light. In today's world, where so many people feel isolated, forgotten, or overwhelmed, perhaps the greatest lesson is this: never underestimate the impact of human connection. A name remembered, a person not forgotten, a family that refuses to give up. Sometimes those things become the reason someone survives. If this story touched your heart, please support our channel by leaving a like, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful and emotional stories like this to people around the world. Thank you again for being here with us today. Stay safe, take care of the people you love, and never stop believing that even after the longest darkness, light can still find its way back.